everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. A little bit different to things you've done in the past. I'm very excited to hear what you make of it. Obviously, the whole reason we hold these webinars and these kind of Q&A sessions is to give everyone attending the opportunity to have an open and honest conversation on different industries, different ways to kind of break into different industries and different types of career, I suppose, which is more relevant to this one today. So we're absolutely delighted to have Jumpstart with us today to talk a little bit about working in startups, accessing startups, and what that looks like for anyone who doesn't know much about it yet. So we've got Ellie and Rachel with us, who are here to answer all of your questions.
So thank you everyone for coming to see the webinar today. Like Laura said, we're going to be chatting a bit about startup graduate careers and sort of what that can look like. Also just taking you through some basic definitions of startups, because I know that when I was in university and like from my own experience, startups were not on my radar at all. I couldn't tell you what a startup was. And I'm now working for Jumpstart, which is a startup that works with other startups. So it's like never too late to get to know startups and realize it's like the right career option for you. So we'll start with a quick introduction. So I'm Ellie. I'm the Access and Marketing Lead at Jumpstart. We'll explain a bit more about what Jumpstart does a bit later on, but basically we are a startup graduate program, so we'll help you find full-time roles in startups. As the Access and Marketing Lead, I run all of the marketing initiatives for the company. So with all of the initiatives to try and get like brilliant people like you onto the program. And I also run all of our access initiatives as well. Basically, this is just to make the startup like sector more accessible for as many people as possible. I think historically there's been this stereotype surrounding startup careers that they're not for everyone, and we're sort of trying to challenge that at Jumpstart, and that's one of the key parts of my role. And we're also joined by Jumpstart alum Rachel. If you want to say a quick hi, Rachel.
Yeah, hi. I'm Rachel, and as it says, I'm a founders associate, which I can talk a little bit more about later. And I found my role at Mosaic Health through Jumpstart's 12th cohort, which again I'll talk about later.
Yeah. So exactly, Rachel's going to be chatting a bit more about her experiences in the startup world. But as you can see here, we're going to start by just going through some basic definitions of startups, what they sort of mean, the type of industries and roles that you can expect yourself to go into. Then we're going to go into a why startup section, sort of like why startups might be suited to you. And that's going to be completely led by the brilliant Rachel. And then we're going to go back into Jumpstart and explaining a bit more detail how the program works once you understand a bit more about startups. Great. So quickly at the beginning, we're just going to tell you a quick summary of what Jumpstart is. Like I mentioned, at the end, we're going to go through it in a bit more detail. But in simple terms, we're a graduate program for startups. We help graduates who, if you graduate in the last 0 to 2 years, to find full-time roles in startups in different sectors all across the UK. Every 6 weeks or so, we select and train recent graduates, and we place them into London's most exciting tech startups. We've written London here just because most of our startups just happen to be based in London. It's kind of the nature of the startup sector, but a lot of the roles are also remote, so you don't actually have to be based in London to be able to participate in the program at all. And also lots of people are based like all over the UK, and then they end up moving to London once they have a role, so there's no obligation for you to be based in London to take part. Once you start working in your startup, you'll join alongside a cohort of loads of other grads. We all do it in sort of cohorts, about 30 to 40 grads each time, so you'll meet a lot of other brilliant people on the program, and you'll receive ongoing mentorship and support from ourselves and also our brilliant like mentor community. We have lots of senior mentors and people like that who can give you career advice as you go on in your career. So before we sort of go into like Jumpstart program and things like that, it's worth just telling you a bit more about startups. We call this section like our Startup 101. So we'll take you through the definitions, the industries, and the roles that you can expect to see in the startup sector. So I feel like a good disclaimer at the beginning is that startup can mean a lot of different things. If you Google the word startup, probably you can find 1,000,001 different definitions of what startup can mean to different people. We sort of like to use this graph here to just show how amorphous the startup definition can be. So we've worked with one company called SunSave here on the left, which has less than 10 people in its team, still counts as a startup. We have one company here called Vera Health, which has 20 to 50 people, and it still counts as a startup. And then Monzo, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, would not necessarily count as a startup anymore. It was a startup once, but now it's a really huge company with 1,000+ people, and it's more of like a scale up in nature, but it still has that startup culture and loads of elements that you still see in startups. So we sort of come up with our criteria of what we think a top startup looks like, because this is sort of how Jumpstart tends to define what a startup tends to be, basically. So the first point is top startup in our eyes is venture capital backed. If you don't know what the term venture capital means, we sort of like to imagine it like a bank. So you can get venture capital firms, which are basically like big banks for startups, and they invest money in companies to help them grow and help them get big and successful. And in return for them giving you sort of a big loan to help you start your company, they take a percentage of the company, so they partially own it, and they give you like a ton of direction to help you sort of grow fast and be successful. So we think a startup is a top startup if they're venture capital backed, because it means they have this money to be financially stable and they have the means to grow fast and sort of be a really secure company. After that, often a top startup is internet-based and digitally focused. So not necessarily like a shop wouldn't count as a startup, but maybe like something that has like this sort of website, or they offer like a service. Even if they have a physical product that they're selling, often they are completely like digitally based and you can just find them on the internet. So we'll take you through some of the startups that we actually work with in different sectors so you can understand that a bit better, but generally they just tend to be based on the internet. And the last point is that most top startups have ambitions to grow fast over the next 1 to 2 years. This is often helped by the fact that they're venture capital backed, so they have that money and the means to grow fast. But we work with startups that we see as having the potential just to be the next big thing. So like Monzo is one that you've heard of, and Facebook and Google, they were all startups once. And we like to think that a bunch of the startups that we work with at Jumpstart, and startups in just the UK space more generally, have the potential to be huge successful companies because they're doing something innovative and they have the ambitions to grow super fast over the next couple of years. So now I've taken you through, I guess, like a really basic definition of what startups can look like. I think it's probably worth just going through the vast variety of industries that you can see in the startup world. I think that this slide is just going to be scraping the surface of the type of industries that you can see, but I'll just take you through a quick summary of them now. So one type of industry that we really commonly see in the startup world are fintechs, or finance tech companies. So these are all just startups that are working in the finance space. So Monzo, again, is one that you would probably recognize, and they're obviously working in the finance space. Another one that we've worked with, which I think is like super, super cool, is WageStream, and they're a social impact finance startup. Basically, what they do is they help frontline workers, like nurses, for example, stream their wages so they can get more of their wage earlier in the month so they can afford to do things. Like a common example that they give is like, if you're a single parent who's working as a nurse, you can stream your wages and get them earlier in the month so you can like afford to like feed your children, for example. And yeah, it's like a really, really cool social impact startup. And so it sort of shows that like finance doesn't actually necessarily have to always be about like numbers. It can be, you can see the real positive impact of what you're doing in that space. Another sector that we really commonly work with, and it's one of my favorite ones actually, is the social impact sector. So Zero Gravity is one that a lot of you might have heard of, because I know they work a lot with universities, and we've placed 1,000,000,001 jump starters in that company now. They basically match student mentors with people from like less privileged backgrounds to help them get into some of the top universities in the UK. And they're really cool and they're making a really massive impact right now. Beam is another one that we've placed quite a few jump starters in. They are a homelessness charity trying to tackle homelessness in the UK and just doing some like really cool work. Another sector that we work with is a health tech sector, or femtech, which is sort of like a subset of the health tech sector that's specifically focusing on like women's health. So we have a couple examples of startups here. Vera Health, which I mentioned earlier, is one of my favorite ones here. They're a startup that's working to sort of tackle misconceptions and also just spread more information about like women's health, in particular menopause care, because it's sort of like I think a big subset of like women's healthcare that's just completely missed and off the radar, and people don't talk about it because it's quite taboo. And they're making like big strides to try and make that a more like accessible place for the healthcare, basically. Another sector is e-commerce. When I was mentioning earlier that startups can have a physical product and they can create something that like they do directly sell to people, this is the sort of thing that we meant. So for example, we work with a company called Lick, and we place quite a few starters there, and they create like paint and wallpaper and they sell it directly to consumers, but they're all digitally based and they sort of work in like an office and they have their own like website and things like that. Another one that you might have heard of is Get Here, and if you haven't heard of that, you might have heard of Gorillas, which is a really similar company to Get Here, and that's another one that we've worked with, that there's sort of like home deliveries of your own like sort of product that you get in shops, basically. You can also work with startups in the climate tech. This is a sector that we've seen is like very, very popular amongst graduates, because obviously it's just like a growing space and a really important space to be in. So SunSave was one of the ones on the previous slide, and that's a company that's making solar panel like electricity more like accessible, which is like really, really cool. And Supercritical is another one that's doing like carbon offsetting, which obviously is again a really important space to be in, and we've got starters at those companies as well. And then deep tech and AI is obviously a really, really growing space. I'm sure lots of you have seen all the stuff about Chat GPT or whatever it's called recently. And so like obviously AI is a really exciting space to be in right now. One company that we've worked with here is Hypermile. They're really cool. They're working to use AI to make cruise control for like big, massive, heavy duty trucks. And I think the idea of using like AI and cruise control for that is completely wild. But the idea is behind it is to try and make them more fuel efficient and sort of like save time and make them more efficient in general, which is quite cool. And one last space that we work with is education tech. Basically, these are just like startups that are trying to like improve the way people access education through just like different softwares and stuff like that. So CoLeap, for example, is a company that does cohort-based education. So you can sign up for different courses and you complete them online along with a whole cohort of other people. So you can chat to each other as you're learning and it's all completely online. But yeah, this is like it mentioned, scraping the surface of the different industries that we can work with in the startup world. These are some of the ones we'd say are most like hot right now, but I often find speaking to grads that people are just like surprised and blown away by just the sheer variety of companies out there. So I would not even take this as like verbatim of all the industries that are out there. This is just literally scraping the surface. So I've taken you through some of the industries that you can expect to see in the startup world. I think it's worth now saying some of the most common roles that grads can expect to do in a startup. These, I would say, are the 4 most common roles that we see grads going into, but that is by no means the only roles that we see grads going into. So the first most common one is a marketing role, commonly called like a marketing executive or a marketing associate. This is all about communicating with customers about how great your product is. So talking about like just trying to get the word about your product out there to people in as many engaging ways as you can think of. This can often be working on social media, but it can also be working in sales. It can be working just like communicating it through other digital channels, just basically getting the word out about your product, which is a really good job to do if you're sort of have a more creative mindset, I'd say. Another really common role that we see grads going into is an operations role. This is all about managing the inner workings of a startup, making sort of everything optimized, recognizing where there are problems and just trying to improve and always just trying to make the business run as smoothly as possible. Also, we see data analysts come up quite a lot. This is a really good role to go into if you sort of are a bit more quantitative, I'd say. If you like get really excited by crunching the data and finding ways to sort of improve the company. Similar to operations, it's all about optimizing the business and just sort of helping that business get better, make forecasts for the future, and just identify any issues that you see to just help them always improve and grow. And the last most common role that we see, and obviously one that Rachel herself is in, is the founder associate role. We call this the right-hand person of the founder, because basically you work directly with a founder in a company and you work across all areas of the company. It's like the most generalist role that you can get, basically, and you get a taste of lots of different areas of the company by working this role. We often say that this is a really great role to go into if you envision yourself possibly starting your own business one day, because the founder associate role is it's the best way to get a taste of what it's really like to be a founder and really like to work across a business. So yeah, that is a taste of the type of roles that we generally put grads in Jumpstart. So I've taken you through the Startup 101, and I think now is the perfect time to hand over to the wonderful Rachel, who's going to take us a bit more through why you might want to go into startups, why it might be suited to you. So over to you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, Ellie. That was fantastic. So to introduce myself again, I'm Rachel, and as Ellie mentioned, I'm the Founders Associate at Mosaic Health. So Founders Associate, absolutely right, that I am the right-hand person of the CEO and founder at Mosaic. I help out in a super general capacity with absolutely anything the founder needs me to do. Mosaic Health, so to describe the industry, we are a health insure tech. It kind of gets more niche sometimes as you go down. We are a tech-enabled company effectively creating bespoke healthcare for startups. So yeah, so a bit more about me. We've got a little timeline. So I was born and grew up in Birmingham. I went to a primary state secondary school. I started working at about 14, just in sort of part-time jobs. And whilst I was in school, I kind of realized that I didn't have any traditional work experience that would typically be accepted by, more typical graduate employers. Like I'd never worked in an office or anything like this. So I thought, wow, okay, I need to go out and get some kind of office job. And so I found an apprenticeship with the UK government. whilst I was working there, I applied to Oxford and fantastically secured a place at Oxford studying philosophy, politics, and economics, which I loved so much. During university, I wanted to get involved in as many extracurriculars as possible. I did sort of societies ranging from international development to creative direction and pretty much every sport under the sun. And sort of outside of university, I came across climate activism work. And this climate activism work is actually what gave me the most work experience that I ever really got. I was managing a team in this space. I was sort of helping out people, delivering projects, which these are the kinds of things that you'll be doing in your job. But I think nobody ever really tells you that you can get this experience in non-traditional ways. And I think this is something that Jumpstart emphasizes fantastically, that you can get experience that will benefit you so much in your day-to-day job from really non-traditional places. So then in July 2022, I graduated from uni and was looking for a job and came across Jumpstart. So I applied for Jumpstart in about summer, went through the process to get on the program. And with Jumpstart, I applied to 5 companies. I secured 2 offers from 2 very different companies. One company which had, I think, about 80 people in it, and Mosaic Health, which only has 5 people working in it. So it was quite different. But ultimately, I wanted to go ahead with the founder's associate role for the reason that I just think the role is something incredibly specific, that the kind of experience I was going to get in this role, I would not have been able to get anywhere else. So I started as founder's associate at Mosaic Health in October. I'm 2 months in and loving it so much. So the next thing, so we think you will enjoy a startup career if, firstly, you love having a varied workload. I can honestly say that the workload at Mosaic Health has been more varied than I could have possibly envisioned. In the same day, I can go from researching projects to grow the company, to writing articles, to building internal infrastructure, to attending conferences, both online and in person. Almost all of these, might I add, are my first time doing. So it's incredibly varied and I'm learning as I go, which is great. So next, we think you'll enjoy working in a startup. If you have to take on more responsibility than in a traditional graduate role. For me personally, as I said, I work on a team of only 5. So all of my actions directly affect the outcome of the business. And I can really see this in the work that I'm doing. With regards to responsibility, my boss has actually charged me with leading some projects. So sort of setting them out, planning them, enacting them, basically delivering something from start to finish. And I think this kind of thing, I don't think you'd be allowed to do this in a traditional graduate scheme for probably about a year. So the responsibility it comes very early. So next, if you're looking for a role with great progression and training opportunities, you will love to work in a startup. That is sort of somewhat related to the responsibility and experience. There is such fantastic progression opportunities in startups. I personally have only been here for 2 months, so I haven't quite got the promotion yet, but I know for a fact that the experience I've got in these 2 months will make it so much easier and so much quicker for me to get a promotion in future, either internally in my company or outside of it. So you will enjoy working in a startup career if you're able to work in a less structured and a fast-paced environment. It's definitely true that at startups, there is less structure than in some sort of more traditional, larger companies. And this was actually something that worried me a bit before going into startups. But I've come over time to realize that sometimes you kind of hide behind this structure. I sometimes in previous work that I've done would spend much longer planning and less time actually executing. And so structure, I think, can actually hold you back. And for me, being part of the not a less structured environment has actually been the best thing. It's taken me really out of my comfort zone and really boosted my learning curve. And the fact that there's less structure means that you can build the structure as you go. And it's enabled me to build the culture of the organization that I want to work at and I love to work at as I'm going, which you're just not going to get to do if you're kind of a cog in a really, really big machine. Okay, so the next thing about startups is they tend to be more flexible than traditional roles. My team personally is fully remote, so theoretically I could work from anywhere. And I'm actually going to work from anywhere. I've just had the approval to go and work remotely for a month in Paris in April. And this is so not something you'd be able to do the traditional role. The hours are also considerably more flexible. Startups tend to be more results oriented. So you just deliver the work that you need to be doing, and there's no set hours that you will be doing for most startups, although it does vary between them. And the last thing, which I think lends itself very specifically to the founder's associate role, is that if you're thinking about starting your own business in the future, even if you're thinking about it just a little bit, working in a startup career will really, really boost your confidence in that area. I'd never really thought about starting a business ever. I've always been quite entrepreneurial, but I never really thought I'd have the experience or the ability to start a business myself. But after 2 months, the likelihood is really kind of increasing, and I'm never going to say never to starting my own business. And I think that's because of this founder's associate role that I've been in. So with regards to startups, in all seriousness, I hadn't heard too much about startups before I found Jumpstart. It was actually Jumpstart that inspired me to do research into startups and really shift my mindset from applying to traditional graduate schemes. So with that in mind, I'll try and bust some myths for you. So some people think in startups you have to work ridiculous hours. That is absolutely not the case. As I've mentioned, your hours tend to be a lot more flexible than in other sectors, as long as you meet your targets. Sometimes at crunch points, you might have to work a bit more, but I think often this doesn't feel too bad when you do have to do that, because you can really see the impact that your work is having in a tangible outcome for the business. So next myth is that startups are an undiverse sector. I think historically this has been true, and as with every industry, we're just not there yet. And I think because it's a tech industry, it can be a little male dominated, and I think that is true. But we need to kind of be the change that we want to see, right? And I think startups are super amenable to change. They're built in a way that can adapt, and because we can build our own structures, we can really build diversity into these organizations and build structures that will allow for the whole sector to become more diverse. I think the rate of change in startups is just quicker, which is lending itself much more to diversity. So another myth is that startups are high risk, and I'm sure everyone's heard that 90% of startups fail or something like that. But that might well be true. But for a lot of the startups that Jumpstart are talking about, because they're venture capital backed, they're a lot more stable, and typically there's kind of lots of funding rounds that go on that increase the stability of the organization. Ultimately, maybe your startup won't work out entirely, but I think for most startups, you'll probably be working there for only a handful of years. And if it were to go bust down the line, you either wouldn't be there, or it wouldn't be, there's nothing kind of on your shoulders on that end. So yeah, another myth is that you have to be techie to work in tech. I definitely almost fell for this myth. I thought I'm not techie, these are all tech companies that I'm just not right. They're just not right for me. But I was entirely wrong. There are so many different roles that you can do within tech companies. My company is a tech company where more than half of our team members are developers, sort of doing all the coding and this kind of thing. And I'm a entire generalist in my company. I've kind of come to learn a little bit more about what the developers do, but not being techie in this area just did not hold me back whatsoever. I think I'm thriving in this technical team. So finally, is that startups don't pay that well. I honestly this just isn't true. I think what I'm earning now is pretty much exactly what I would have been expecting to earn from any other graduate scheme that I was applying for. And in fact, Jumpstart, the pay scales for Jumpstart are the highest I've seen of any other kind of startup job site that I've come across. So startup work through Jumpstart absolutely does pay well. There we go.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Rachel. That was really, really interesting. So now Rachel has hopefully taught you sort of whether startups might be suited to you. I'm going to just take you through a bit of what you can be doing now to help prepare for startup careers and applications if you're interested in applying. So firstly, it's probably worth going through what startups actually look for in candidates. Through working at Jumpstart and seeing thousands and thousands of applications for startups, we have sort of narrowed it down to the top 3 attributes that we think are most important to have in the startup world. The first one being a proactive mentality. So we sort of see this as someone who's able to take a task and run with it and own it without very little guidance. Someone who's able to recognize a problem and an issue before it actually happens, and to be able to come up with those solutions and sort of foresee things happening and be able to proactively just come up with solutions to things and always help to work towards the mission of the startup. Another attribute that we look for is structured thinking. So are you able to see a complex problem, break it down, work out what that core of the problem is, apply an inquisitive mindset to it, and then work out the solution? Someone who's just really logical and able to break down a problem is really suited to the startup world. And lastly, we sort of look for people who are hardworking or willing to get your hands dirty. So we've written here, willing to run through a brick wall. That's not necessarily true, but we're just looking for people who are able to just work really hard and towards a startup mission. Someone who wants to see a task through to completion, even if it sometimes is unglamorous. I think there's a myth that some jobs are more glamorous than others. I think all jobs have unglamorous elements to it, and startups are looking for people who can kind of revel in the unglamorous sides of things because they know that it's working towards something that's really, really cool in the end, and the startup mission, which is really important. So yeah, proactivity, structured thinking, and hardworking, getting your hands dirty are attributes that are really important for the startup world. So how can you develop those skills now whilst you're in university, or if you're a recent graduate, or if you're about to start university? These are kind of our top tips for developing those skills. The first one being practice your quantitative skills now. I know we said you don't have to be techie to work in tech, and you definitely do not, but Excel skills and things like that always come in handy in literally any job that you go into. There's always going to be a point where you have to just pull together a quick Excel sheet. So it's sort of worth getting those skills together now to prepare you for the startup world. There are a bunch of different YouTube tutorials you can watch to sort of get up to scale with the basics of Excel, and you don't really need to know any more than just the basics. The most important thing we think is to just be proactive, whether that's in your studies, in getting involved in extracurriculars, volunteering, getting involved in a side hustle. By side hustles, it can be anything from starting your own Depop shop, to starting your own blog, to your own YouTube channel, to getting involved in some activism, like Rachel mentioned. Literally anything at all that just sort of interests you and gets you excited, and just something that isn't necessarily just going through your studies as usual. If you don't have time for the extracurriculars and the proactivity, we think that a really important thing is, like we mentioned before, just showing that you're hardworking. Is this through your studies and just getting really great grades and just doing really well on a certain project that you were super passionate about? Or is it just through doing part-time work or something outside of your studies that just shows that the fact that you were doing that part-time work and alongside while studying at uni just shows that you're a super hardworking person? And on top of that, we think if you're interested in going in the startup world, it's worth just getting to grips with the startup world and just staying up to date with the latest news, the trends, the sectors, things that are happening. I would recommend just looking for any books and media that interest you the most, but we've put our sort of top 3 here that we'd recommend to get you started. So The Hustle is a newsletter that just keeps you up to date on just latest startup news in the UK. My First Million is a podcast which sort of tells you about the journeys of different founders and CEOs and stuff like that, and just sort of how they got to where they are. And Sifted is sort of a global news site about the latest startup trends, different funding rounds that startups have gone through, and just the latest news in the startup world. And so those are really good things to stay on top of if you sort of are interested in the sector. And so you might be wondering that some of these skills don't seem like sort of conventional, traditional like experience you would normally include on a CV. And yeah, I guess they're not, but in startups, we are interested in this like unconventional experience. We're mostly interested in you showing that you're proactive, you're hardworking, you have great people skills, and you care about making an impact. So these experiences are really important to include in your CV, but you might not be sure exactly how to incorporate them. So, for example, if you worked in hospitality whilst you're at university, a really great way to include this in your CV is just saying, I worked X amount of hours a week alongside my studies doing this job like X. Also, if you worked in a team, you can talk about your team building skills that you did like whilst in hospitality. If you sort of improved something in the company, like maybe made a process more efficient, that's something you could also include here. And all of that stuff just contributes towards you looking hardworking, even though you don't have necessarily like corporate work experience or like professional work experience. Other than that, I know like some people might have like caring or home responsibilities, which means they're unable to get professional work experience or unable to participate in extracurriculars. And we still think this is really important experience that you can include in your CV if you feel comfortable doing it. And one way to include this is if you can say that you're a caregiver for a friend or a relative whilst completing university. Just the line "whilst completing university" just shows that you were hardworking and compassionate and doing something alongside your studies, which just shows that you're able to like just work hard on stuff, which is something that a startup is always engaged with. And if you're involved in student societies and stuff like that, again, not like conventional work experience, but just something that excites you and just gets you a bit interested, this is also something that we would definitely encourage you to include on your CV. So you could say, for example, that you're an editor for a student magazine, you wrote 5 articles on XYZ, and it can be on literally any topic whatsoever, you know, but like it's just sort of something that shows that you're proactive again, and you're doing something outside of your studies that made an impact at uni and had an impact on other people. So I think all of these are really important things to include on your CV. I'd also say that on the Jumpstart website, we have a blog post and a CV template, which can sort of teach you how to incorporate some more unconventional skills into your CV. So I really would recommend taking a look at that as well. So we've now taken you through sort of all the startup basics, everything you can sort of hope to understand about the startup world. And of course, you can ask us more questions, but maybe it's now time to just give you a quick summary of how the Jumpstart program works in case you're interested in applying when you graduate or if you've already graduated. So in quick summary, the Jumpstart program runs every month or every 6 weeks. It's a 4-week program. On the first week of the program, we have what we call our startup spotlights. This is where we bring in 40+ founders of the UK's most exciting startups, and they pitch to you in 15-minute Zoom calls, basically just like we are now, about why you should work for them, which I think sounds completely wild to people when you're very used to just sending 1,000,001 CVs off into the abyss, that like a startup would actually then turn around and be like, we want to pitch to you, we want you on our team. It's sort of a really nice, like, I think, flip and power dynamic for you, where you get to ask startups questions and be like, wait, why should I actually work for you? And you can really work out what companies are best suited to you through that spotlight week. At the end of that week, we ask you to pick your top 5 startups that you'd like to go straight to interview with. We'll then give you training to give you sort of the best interview practice so you can put your best foot forward in those interviews to come. We'll give you sort of the most commonly asked questions that startups ask you in interviews. We'll hold mock interviews with you and we'll give you feedback, so you're just sort of able to be as successful in those interviews as possible. We'll also give you some key workplace skills training, so it'll help you just sort of hit the ground running on any startup role that you take up. Once you've gone through the training, we'll then introduce you to your top 5 startups. You'll have about a 2.5-week interview period where you can interview with all of those startups. And hopefully by the end of that 2.5-week interview period, you should secure a role. If you don't, for whatever reason, you're always invited onto the next cohort and to meet the next startups, because we've selected you for this program because we think you're great and suited to the startup world. So if for whatever reason you don't secure a role the first time round, there's always multiple chances to find the perfect startup role for you. And once you start your full-time role, you're invited to have some ongoing support from the Jumpstart community. We'll give you one-to-one mentorship. We'll match you with someone who's senior in the startup world, whether that be a founder, a chief of staff, something like that. And they can give you some real career mentorship to help you sort of guide you on how to get where you want to be in your career. We'll also run group sessions, ongoing training, and you'll have access to our brilliant alumni network. We've now placed I think nearly 300 people in startup roles, and they obviously have they're all really active, proactive people. We run socials throughout the year where you can meet everyone, and they're always just a really fun time to just meet some lovely people who are working in the startup world. So we've just got a quick video here, which just I think gives a really nice summary of what those spotlights look like on the Spotlight Week, gives you a good taste, I think, of the type of startups that come up on the Jumpstart program. And after this video, we can, of course, go into the Q&A and answer some questions, but I think it's a nice way to end the presentation.
I think the first thing to say is a massive congratulations. We've had about 2,000 people, which is a lot of people, apply for this cohort, and you all made it, which is amazing.
We are on a mission to end loneliness amongst older people.
Our role at Super Critical is to remove as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as we possibly can.
We are a women's health company and we focus on better menopause care.
We are reinventing the way that a traditional startup works.
We connect advertisers who are wanting to go into the metaverse with the creators and people that are generating the experiences in there.
We launched the first and only pain-relieving tampons.
Essentially, we are Babylon for dogs and cats.
Really letting users buy crypto as frictionlessly as possible.
Our mission is to make it easier for people to reskill and upskill throughout their careers.
Spill is an all-in-one mental health support tool for employees.
Nice. So yeah, at the end, we ended there by saying, don't join a company, join a mission. That's something that we actually really stand by at Jumpstart, because we think it's the one thing that really separates startup careers from sort of your typical corporate grad schemes and professional grad schemes, because you're in small teams and you're working towards something really innovative. They're just such mission-driven companies that you can really feel like you're making an impact and working towards a mission, which I think is something that's really cool and unique about startup careers. So yeah, any questions? Happy to open the floor to everyone. If you've got any questions for either myself or Rachel, we're really happy to answer them. Any questions about Jumpstart, startup careers, startup definitions, anything at all?
We did have a couple kind of that people sent in advance, I suppose, and that we know from talking to some of the young people we work with, these kind of things are on their mind. Obviously, Rachel, this is probably more for you because you're doing it at the minute, but you spoke a lot about the positives, right, and the real pluses of working in a startup. Is there anything that you feel has been challenging to get used to and to get your head around? Any advice you'd give to anyone who perhaps might not fit into a startup environment or the startup world in general?
So, as I kind of mentioned while I was speaking, I think at the start, the lack of structure was a little bit difficult to overcome. You sort of go into a company sometimes and think that, you know, the person who's hired you, they know exactly what they want you for, they know exactly how they're going to train you, exactly what you're going to be doing, which I think for the most part, just in startups especially, just isn't the case. I kind of struggled with what I was doing, and I think I struggled a little bit with my boss trying to figure out what the right level of work was to give me, or what the right level of communications I needed to be given in order to do a task. But ultimately, the beauty of the founder's associate role is that you and your founder are so close that you can just, if you have an issue, you can almost always just bring it to them. A couple of times my boss just wasn't necessarily giving me the right instructions for the work that I needed to do, and we just had a chat about it and figured it out, and we worked very iteratively, very quickly. And as I said, I think through this, you build a lot more personal connection to your company. And so the work I'm doing, I really see it as important, and I see myself as a huge part of the culture. So yeah, I think potentially that was the most difficult part. The second part of your question with regards to sort of advice for people, I think, you know, either if you get a role through Jumpstart or if you get a role elsewhere, you potentially confidence can kind of inhibit these conversations with your bosses or with your managers. But I think something which can take a while to realize is that you were hired into these companies for a reason, and you really have to back yourself to know what you need best. And so my advice in this vein is always just ask questions and just speak to people about your problems. I think in a work perspective, there's no silly questions. you need what you need, and yeah, you just need to have that confidence to back yourself and ask those questions.
It's such an interesting lesson that comes with time, isn't it? You know, going from being just grateful for any opportunity that people offer you to realizing that they want you, and that actually is exactly as you said. You know, in an interview scenario, for example, you're interviewing a company, right, as much as they're interviewing you, and that's why the pitching idea is really nice. You get the opportunity to do just that in a kind of protected environment. You said, well, you both went through the program, right? You both Rachel, you mentioned startups weren't really on your radar, but what was the motivation? Obviously, speaking to final years, and many of whom are in the audience today, this time is so confusing. There's a lot to consider. There's a lot to weigh up. Why did you both choose to apply to the program? What was your thought process in the final year of your studies?
Should I take this first? Yeah, I can take it. I actually, when I first graduated uni, I was really set on going to the charity sector because I was so passionate just about doing social impact in like whatever career I ended up being in. And so that's why I was looking at the charity sector. And like I mentioned before, startups were just not on my radar at all. But as soon as I heard about Jumpstart, I think I saw like an ad for it on LinkedIn or something like that. And as soon as I heard about it, I was like, wait, this is another way that I can be making social impact that isn't necessarily in the charity sector. And so I was not going to lie, simultaneously applying for charity jobs and startup jobs, but ultimately I ended up getting an offer from Jumpstart, and I just like sort of took it up because I just thought the opportunity to speak to about 40 plus companies at once and just get to grips with like that area of the world, I just think was really exciting for me, and like I could just see the way I could make an impact just much more obviously.
Yeah, and I suppose for me, I sort of was applying in my final year for, you know, your very traditional corporate consulting type roles. And the more I found out about them, just sort of the more I realized that they just weren't for me at that time. And I just wasn't going to be getting the experience that I wanted. Looking back, I have no idea how I came across Jumpstart. I think it came up in a Google search or it popped up in LinkedIn or something like that. But I just remember that as soon as I knew about it and as soon as I knew about what it was, it has been everything that it cracked up to be. The more I learned about it, the more it just was such a great program. You know, as you said, you interviewing the startups as much as you're interviewing them. It almost seems too good to be true, and I'm sort of yet to find a downside of it. So, yeah.
Cool, interesting. I think it's nice for people to know the kind of thought process of people who've been where they are. Right, it's a difficult time. People have a lot on their plate in final year. Thank you for that. More on to then the Jumpstart process in particular. Ellie, there are quite a lot of questions in here about your recruitment process, I suppose your application process. Do you want to just run through that and I'll take off any that you answer as you go? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. I can give a quick like rundown of how it works. So like I mentioned, obviously, like the Jumpstart program is a 4-week process, but you have to apply to get onto the program initially. Our application process is pretty quick. You have to just submit an initial CV and just a few bits of information about yourself, which if you already have a CV should take less than a minute for you to fill in the form. But if you don't have a CV, like I mentioned already, we have a CV template that you can use, and also a blog post of all of our top tips on how to incorporate unconventional work experience into a CV to sort of give you the best, like, well, make sure you're well prepared for the Jumpstart application. Once you fill in that form, we do ask one question after that about what's the most like proactive thing that you've done outside of your like studies, and like basically that's just to show whether you're proactive or not, because like I mentioned before, startups really look for evidence of proactivity. Our top tips for answering that question would be something along the lines of just coming up with an example outside of your studies where you've just made an impact. Doesn't matter what it is, but if you just give an example of when you've made an impact and sort of what you got out of it and how you think that makes you suited to the startup world, is a really good way to answer that question. Once you've filled in those initial forms, we'll then get in touch with you. If we think you're the right sort of person for the program, you'll be invited to an interview with one of the Jumpstart team. We have quite a big bunch of interviewers now, and we'll interview you within like a few weeks before your cohort start date. The interview should last no longer than 45 minutes. It sort of includes like some motivational questions about startups and also a quick case study about one of our startup partners. If you pass the interview, you'll then be invited to join the cohort, and that's when the whole program starts, that 4-week process where you go and meet all the startups, interview with them, get our training, and then join our community. Yeah, I hope that covers like quite a few of the questions that you might have had.
Yeah, it absolutely did. And just one on kind of time frame. So obviously they apply to join a cohort. Do they know in advance when they submit an application how long it'll be before they know if that application is successful, or until they know the next steps of the application process?
Yeah, so we try and get back to people as soon as possible regarding their application. If you apply for more like a cohort that's like sooner, so like we mentioned, we run our cohorts every month or every 6 weeks. If you apply for one, say now, that's like in February, you're likely to hear back a lot quicker than if you apply for one now that's due in like September next year. We say the latest that you can hear back is for around a month before the cohort starts, but we always try and get back to people sooner regarding like next steps and things like that. We'd recommend just applying as close to the cohort start date as you sort of want to, just because that we think that allows you to build up more experience on your CV that might be relevant to like the startup world and gives you just the best chance of success.
Fab. There were a couple of questions on time frame there, so I just thought I'd ask the question so people are aware. So then on to the kind of, when you apply for startups, you list your top 5. There's a question in here about the roles within that. So can you apply for more than one role within the same startup, or are you applying for the startup? So I suppose applying for the role or applying for the startup, which way around does it work?
So the startups will come in and they'll pitch to you, and often the startups will be hiring for more than one role. You can, when you apply to the startup, specify which role that you want to apply for, but also a lot of our grads aren't entirely sure what role they want to be in, but they know they want to work for a specific startup. And so if that happens, we make an introduction and just say they'd like to have an initial conversation about roles and see where their skills best align. And then you can have sort of an initial chat with the startup, working out which role would suit you best. But most people apply for a specific role within a specific startup.
Cool. Fab. I hope that answered your question. You touched on this in the presentation, but the likelihood of landing a role during the Jumpstart process, do you have stats on it to share with the group, or is it, I don't know, any advice that you give them?
So typically about 80% of people who go through the program land a role within the first like month or so of being on the program. Like I mentioned before, though, if you're unsuccessful the first time round, we re-invite you back, and then that percentage sort of goes higher and higher. So like if you don't get it the first time round for whatever reason, it can often be on the startup side of things and just like sort of changing their mind about wanting to make a graduate hire, which is unfortunate, but just sometimes happens. If that happens, like I mentioned before, we select you because we think you're great, and so we will happily introduce you to more startups and sort of let you go through the program again to try and help you find your best match. So yeah, typically within like a few months on the program, you were like very high likely to secure a role, but generally it happens within the first month.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And a question for both of you, I suppose, both on your Jumpstart interview and your interviews for the roles that you're in now. Is there anything that you feel you did in your interview that helped you secure your job? Any advice that you give to anyone potentially for Jumpstart interviews or for interviews in general?
Shall I go first on this, Rachel?
Sure.
Well, actually, I used to run all the Jumpstart interviews for people like who wanted to enter the program. So I have a lot of experience of interviewing and assessing people who wanted to get on Jumpstart. And so I kind of know like what would always stand out. I think it's just people who can show their clear like motivation for that industry. So like we assess lots of like your motivation more than your competency. And so we really want to see someone who's like passionate and proactive and excited about the startup sector. And that can be through doing your own research on the types of startups that particularly interest you. It can just be looking on our website and seeing an example, or reading one of our blog posts about like a grad who's gone through the program and thinking, wow, that really sounds like me. I really want to like be doing that. I think being able to give examples of sort of that little bit of extra research about startup careers that you've done is a really great way to show it. On top of that, we give a case study task for you to complete in the interview, and this will be on one of our startup partners, and this will be assessing kind of your use of structured thinking, like we mentioned earlier. That's like one thing that we really look for, and communication skills as well. You often ask them to sort of pull together like a quick presentation or something like that in the interview. These are like things that like, I guess like a little bit harder to practice, but I think just becoming comfortable with the fact that if you're going to do a case study problem, you don't have to get the answer right, but it's just about showing how you approach the answer and how you communicate your answer are actually the really important things there. But yeah, that's like a few tips on like the Jumpstart interview from my side. I don't know if Rachel, you have some more specific experiences for startup interviews.
Yeah, so there are kind of two things that jump out as, you know, my greatest interview tips. I think one of them is just really honing in on fit, both of yourself to where you're applying and where you're applying to yourself. So whether that be your Jumpstart interview where you're trying to get onto the process, or whether that be for your applying for your startup, A lot of people in interviews, I think, try to focus either on why they love this company so much or why this company is so fantastic, or they'll think like what can I do for this company, right? The best thing is to find a really good match of both. So you need to figure out why this company is perfect for you in your career journey at this time, as well as, you know, kind of the skills that will fit for this company too. So you want it to be working both ways, because isn't it, as I keep saying, it's an interview both ways. The company needs to be right for you. And I think when this is true, because it's always better when it's true, right? When it's true, it is like, I think that's the best fit, and that's when you're most likely to succeed and be truthful and you'll be honest in your interview. The second thing, which when you do Jumpstart, when you get onto the process, they give interview tips for getting into the startup. So, you know, there's a whole preparation session. The training Jumpstart do is really fantastic, and I think it's definitely why I secured 2 offers. But the best tip I got, which I had never actually heard before, is just do something that's a little bit above and beyond what you're being asked to do. Everyone's going to be doing, you know, as much as they can, but if you try and just do something a little bit unconventional and a little bit over the top, not necessarily over the top, but more than you're being asked, I think it really just jumps out and shows your commitment. For startup interviews, you'll typically have a case study where they'll kind of give you a task, you go away, research it, and then present on it. If you just do a little bit something extra, prepare just a little bit something more than they ask, it just shows that actual level of commitment, and it puts really into context the stuff you're saying on your CV and proves to the startups that it is actually true. And I do think that's why I got the offers that I got, because I just went a little bit above and beyond. Nothing too crazy, but just a little bit.
Great advice. There are a couple here then on slightly more specific, but for any international students watching the webinar, how many of the startups, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, Ellie, and it might be a case by case basis, but how many can sponsor visas? Do you know?
Yeah, it's a case by case basis, really. We do try and include, it's normally in the minority of startups on our program are willing to do visa sponsorship. But when we start our Spotlight Week, we give you sort of a bunch of information in a table about all the different startups. And one of the columns there is whether they can offer visa sponsorship or not. And normally it can be like a couple per cohort, but it isn't generally like a thing that startups are willing to do like upfront. It's more something like once you've like worked for them, and often if you're on your like 2-year post-study work visa, once you've worked for them for a bit and sort of like, I guess, become more a solid part of the team, they're often willing to then consider visa sponsorship. But yeah, a couple do it up front, but it's more in like the minority.
Perfect, makes sense. Thank you for that. A lot of thank yous in here as well. You'll be glad to know. One last question then, I suppose, to kind of summarize before we let everyone go and let you guys go back to your evenings. People put a lot of emphasis on kind of knowing what you want to do and having it all sussed out and you know, making this plan that you're all working towards. Open and honestly, do you have that in place? Do you know what you want to do? Was this a plan? Do you want to share a little bit about that for the students watching?
Yeah, sure. I mean, no, it wasn't not a plan for me whatsoever. I think, like I mentioned earlier, I was so not set on the startup sector at all. I didn't even sort of consider doing like a marketing role at all. I sort of knew I wanted to do something where I could make impact, and I also wanted to do something creative. So I kind of just went for the first roles that I could think of that would make an impact and that would be considered creative. And so I was looking predominantly at sort of charity sector roles, and I did like a bunch of volunteering when I first finished university to sort of like build up a bit of experience in that sense. But literally did not consider startups until I came across Jumpstart, and I still don't really know after this role where I necessarily like want to go next, but I do know that I'm really enjoying this role now and that I'm actually getting a bunch of really useful experience, because like the job is so varied and I'm just doing so many different things, taking on so much responsibility that I sort of know wherever I want to go next, this is a really great stepping stone for that.
And yeah, I'm sure people will be glad to hear I equally have had no idea. I mean, I thought I wanted to do consulting, and then it just wasn't right for me. And I thought I had this kind of medium long-term plan, and things just don't tend to work out as you expect. Sometimes I think not always, but sometimes planning can just be a little bit silly, because where I am now, I'm loving so much. And even when I started and I stepped theoretical online foot into my workplace, I thought, I'll stay here for a certain amount of time and then I'll maybe move on and do this because this is what my career needs. Even that's kind of gone out the window. The more I'm doing, the more I'm seeing stuff that I'd never even heard of, that I just love doing. And I suppose now my mantra is just like, I know that I want to work hard, and absolutely this is giving me the space to do that. And yeah, just keeping as many doors open as possible is always the best thing you can do. And I think, yeah, that's not too difficult to do when you're a hard worker, I suppose.
Rachel, Ellie, I can't thank you enough for this. That was really great, honestly.